All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, it's a deep dive built specifically for you, our philosophically inclined listener. You asked us to dig into Spinoza's political philosophy, and, well, we listened.
Yeah, so we're diving headfirst into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Spinoza's political philosophy.
And, well, I think our mission here is pretty clear, right? It's to unpack his core ideas about the state, freedom, and power, all in a way that speaks to a philosophical mind.
Absolutely. And while folks tend to fixate on Spinoza's, dense metaphysics, his work on politics is just as insightful, especially for someone who enjoys wrestling with big philosophical questions.
Right. Like, how do we even begin to understand political order in a world governed by natural laws? That's a question Spinoza really grappled with.
Yeah, and to fully appreciate that, we've got to start with the world Spinoza was living in. 17th century Dutch Republic, right?
The SAP entry reminds us that this place had a reputation for tolerance, but it was also simmering with religious and political tensions. It's like you had these huge debates going on between the Arminians and the counter-remonstrants. And then you have Cartesian philosophy making a splash and ruffling some feathers. A pretty dynamic scene for intellectual life.
Oh, absolutely. And Spinoza's own life was right in the thick of it. Like, think about his excommunication from the Jewish community. It was a huge deal. He was accused of straying way too far from traditional doctrines.
Right. And then there's the story of his friend Adrian Corbeg, who was persecuted for, well, basically publishing his own ideas in Dutch. He actually ended up dying in prison.
Yeah. I mean, stories like that really highlight the fragility of intellectual freedom, even in a place known for tolerance. And these experiences clearly had a big impact on Spinoza. It's no wonder he became such a fierce defender of the right to think and speak
Oh,
freely.
for sure. You can totally see how that would shape his views on the limits of political power. And it's not like he was formulating these ideas in a vacuum.
Right. There are some key influences at play here. Obviously, Hobbes is the big one, someone we might want to deep dive into another time.
Well, definitely. But there were other thinkers in the mix, too. Like in the Netherlands, you had folks like Lambert van Velthuizen and the Delacorte brothers who were deeply engaged with Hobbes's ideas.
Yeah. And we can't forget about Machiavelli. The Seppi entry points out a real strain of Machiavellian realism in Spinoza. He was interested in how politics actually works, not just idealized theories.
Right, he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty and look at the messy realities of power.
Sure.
But where Spinoza really charts his own course is in his break from traditional natural law theory. He was all about metaphysical naturalism, this idea that everything, even human actions and political events, operates according to unchangeable laws of nature.
And those laws, they don't care about human purpose or divine plans. It's all just cause and effect, unfolding according to a set of fixed principles.
So the traditional view, the one going all the way back to Aquinas and really dominant in Protestant circles, was that there's a natural moral order we could access through reason.
Yeah. This idea that God had set up this moral blueprint for the universe, and we, with our rational minds, could figure it out.
But Spinoza throws that out the window. He even famously critiques this whole idea, saying that believing in an order disrupted by ignorant humans is like believing in a dominion within a dominion. In other words, a total contradiction within his naturalistic worldview.
Absolutely. Because for Spinoza, even what we might call irrational actions are still a product of natural forces. It's all just nature playing itself out.
And this leads to his unique and sometimes controversial concept of right, as we see in the theological political treatise. He just strips it bare, saying natural right is nothing more than the extent of an individual's power.
Right. It's about what you can actually do, what you're capable of achieving in the world. It's not about some abstract moral code.
And he uses that example of the big fish eating the small fish. It's a bit brutal, but it really drives the point home.
It does. Because in the state of nature, before human laws and institutions, right is literally coextensive with might. It's about what you can enforce, not what some higher authority dictates.
So just to be super clear, this isn't meant to justify might makes right as some kind of moral principle. It's a description of how things actually function in the absence of an overarching moral framework.
Exactly. It's like Spinoza might say that when Cortez conquered the Aztecs, he was exercising his natural right given his superior power. But that doesn't mean Spinoza condoned his actions. It's about recognizing the role of power, not about endorsing any specific moral claim.
Got it. So power is fundamental. And this is where we see a key difference from Hobbes. While Hobbes also talks about natural right, especially that individual liberty to do what you need to survive, particularly in De Civ, there's still this sense of a connection to right reason, to a sincere belief in self-preservation.
Yeah, and you see that in De Cive and even in Leviathan, though maybe Leviathan leans a bit more toward a de facto view of right. But Spinoza, in a letter to Gilles, really spells out this crucial difference.
What does he say?
Well, he says that natural right is always preserved, always fully intact, and that the sovereign's right is always limited by their actual power. Unlike Hobbes, for whom individuals surrender a good chunk of their natural right to the sovereign, Spinoza sees it as an inseparable part of our being.
It's like you can't just give up your natural right. It's tied to your existence, to your capacity to act in the world.
Yeah. So if we're talking about power, not some transferable right, how does obligation fit into all of this? Hobbes had that whole thing about covenants, about promises made under specific conditions.
Right. That was his way of explaining where political obligation came from. But Spinoza offers a totally different perspective.
He says that a contract only has force because it's useful, or at least perceived as useful. If there's no benefit, there's no obligation.
So it's less about keeping promises to the sovereign and more about a practical assessment of what's in your best interest within a given political system.
Exactly. And for Spinoza, a stable political order depends on the sovereign setting things up so that following the rules consistently benefits people. He even says that widespread vice or disobedience actually points to failures within the Commonwealth itself.
So that begs the question, is there any room in Spinoza's system for something like a right to revolution? Like, if the sovereign isn't holding up their end of the bargain?
Well, not in that traditional sense of a divinely granted or inherently moral right to revolt, but Spinoza offers what the SP entry calls a naturalistic equivalent.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Basically, since the sovereign's right comes from their power, if the people somehow diminish that power, the sovereign's right weakens too. It's less about a justification for rebellion and more about recognizing how shifts in power can change who holds authority.
It's like the foundation of their legitimacy crumbles if they can't actually enforce their will.
Precisely. So we've got these redefined notions of right and obligation, but is there any room for normative judgment in Spinoza's system? Like, can he even distinguish between a good state and a bad state?
Yeah, that's a great question. It seems like his focus on power and natural laws might leave little room for making value judgments about political systems.
Right, but there's a subtle distinction here that's super important. Spinoza says there's a difference between acting by right, which we have established is simply acting within your power, and acting in the best way.
Okay, so there is a way to evaluate actions even within this naturalistic framework.
Exactly. For Spinoza, a good state is one that strengthens the collective power and well-being of its citizens. And for individuals within that state, a good political order promotes their own empowerment and freedom. So the focus shifts from abstract moral rules to the actual consequences of different political arrangements.
That makes sense. It's about the effects, the outcomes, not some preordained moral code.
Precisely. So let's shift gears and look at his major work, starting with the Theological Political Treatise. The CEP entry positions this as a direct response to the heated religious and political debates in 17th century Netherlands, especially those surrounding the Calvinist Church.
It's like Spinoza stepping directly into the fray, challenging the dominant voices of his time.
Oh, absolutely. And he had a few goals in mind. He wanted to defend himself against charges of atheism, which sadly continued to plague him. But he was also taking aim at the dogmatism and political influence of theologians.
It's like he saw how this fusion of religious authority and political power could stifle intellectual freedom and lead to all sorts of problems.
Yeah, and for a philosopher like Spinoza, that was simply unacceptable. So he makes this really bold argument for the separation of faith and philosophy, his famous separation thesis.
Right. He's basically saying these two domains need to operate independently, but how does that work? How can you separate something as fundamental as faith from the pursuit of knowledge?
Well, Spinoza defines faith in terms of its practical effects. It's about cultivating piety, charity, and obedience. He downplays the need for metaphysical truth in religious belief, and in doing so, he directly challenges the intellectual authority of the clergy. It's like he's carving out space for philosophy to flourish without being constrained by religious dogma. A pretty revolutionary move for the time.
And this CEP entry does a great job breaking down his argument for this separation. He starts by calling for an unprejudiced reading of Scripture. Then he critiques the idea that Scripture offers deep metaphysical insights. Next, he proposes a naturalistic method for interpreting the Bible.
Yeah, he's basically rejecting the idea of miracles and divine revelation in the traditional sense. And finally, he argues that the real core of Scripture boils down to simple moral truths. It's a systematic deconstruction of traditional religious authority.
So philosophy is free to pursue truth on its own terms. But what about the role of the state in all of this?
Well, this is where Spinoza introduces his single authority thesis, which argues for the absolute sovereignty of the state over all external matters of religion.
Sounds a lot like Erastianism, this idea that the state should have ultimate control over the church.
That's spot on. Spinoza, like thinkers before him like Bodin and Hobbes, believed that sovereignty had to be unified and absolute. Divided authority, in his view, just leads to chaos and instability.
So no room for competing power centers within the state.
Nope. And he uses the example of the Hebrew state to illustrate this point, arguing that the decline of that state was partly due to the priestly class gaining too much power.
So the state has the final say on religious matters, but Spinoza also acknowledges that religion can play a positive role within society, right?
Oh, for sure. He critiques the power grabs of organized religion, but he recognizes that religious belief, especially that core message of loving your neighbor, can motivate people to act morally and contribute to a sense of community.
Especially those who might not be swayed by purely rational arguments, right?
Exactly. It's like reason can endorse the golden rule, but religion often presents it in a way that resonates more deeply with people. The SEP entry even mentions this idea from Rosenthal, who suggests that these shared transcendental beliefs can help overcome those free rider problems and encourage people to cooperate.
It's like even if those beliefs aren't literally true, they can have a powerful effect on behavior.
Right. And Spinoza himself advocated for a universal faith, a kind of civil religion stripped of complex doctrines that could reinforce those basic moral principles and contribute to a more harmonious society.
Okay, so that brings us to one of Spinoza's most famous and important ideas, his defense of toleration, especially freedom of thought and expression. But this seems a bit tricky to reconcile with his argument for state control over religion. How does that work?
It's definitely a balancing act. But the SEP entry makes it clear that Spinoza's primary concern in Chapter 20 of the Theological Political Treatise isn't necessarily about defending every form of religious practice. It's about safeguarding the freedom to philosophize, to think and express your intellectual convictions without fear of punishment.
So religious freedom is kind of a byproduct of this broader commitment to intellectual liberty.
Exactly. And he draws this important distinction between outward expressions of religion, which he says fall under the state's authority for the sake of order, and inward beliefs, which are inherently private and can't be coerced.
So the state can regulate religious practices, but they can't dictate what people believe in their hearts.
Right. And Spinoza's arguments for this freedom to philosophize are rooted in practicality. He says that trying to control people's thoughts is not only impossible, but also creates resentment and instability. It undermines the trust between the sovereign and the people.
But he's not advocating for absolute free speech.
Right. No, there are limits. He's clear that seditious speech, anything that directly challenges the authority of the state or incites division through hatred or deception, must be suppressed to preserve the commonwealth. It's all about finding that balance between individual liberty and the stability of the state.
So back to the theological political treatise. Spinoza also talks about his social contract in chapter 16, this idea that individuals agree to be governed by reason and hand over their right to self-determination to the sovereign.
Yeah, that's right. But this seems to clash with his earlier view of right as power. Like, how can you just transfer your fundamental power through a contract?
It does seem like a bit of a puzzle.
It is, and it's something scholars have debated for a long time. Some see this as a potential inconsistency in Spinoza's early political thought, maybe explaining why his emphasis shifts in the political treatise. Others try to reconcile it with his naturalism by distinguishing between potentia, which refers to your inherent capacity to act, and potestas, which is more about your socially granted authority.
Okay, so maybe individuals don't actually give up their fundamental potentia, but they agree to submit to the potestas of the sovereign in exchange for the benefits of living in a stable society.
Exactly. And this submission isn't necessarily a one-time contract signing. It's more like an ongoing dynamic of deference and dependence. But even with that distinction, the Sesti entry points out that some passages in the theological political treatise are still tricky to fully reconcile with a purely naturalistic interpretation.
So the debate continues. Now let's move on to Spinoza's other big political work, the political treatise. The Seppi entry tells us that this is where things get a bit more systematic and analytical. It's less about engaging with theological arguments and more about laying out a clear vision for how the state should be structured.
Yeah, it's like he's shifting gears, becoming more of a political theorist, offering a practical guide for creating a well-ordered society.
And it's interesting because he seems to move away from the contractual language we saw in the theological political treatise. Instead, he emphasizes that the state, like everything else, is a natural thing, governed by natural laws.
Exactly. He's grounding his political philosophy in a deep understanding of human nature, arguing that we need to look at the common nature or condition of men to understand why states form and how they function.
So it's less about some hypothetical agreement and more about recognizing the inherent drives and vulnerabilities that lead humans to form political communities.
Precisely. He's saying that our individual weaknesses and the constant threat of conflict in the state of nature push us towards seeking security and cooperation within a commonwealth.
Now, in the political treatise, he shifts the focus away from abstract rights and towards a more practical question: the best condition of each state.
Right. He's less concerned with theoretical debates about what the state is entitled to and more focused on how to actually create a good and stable political order.
And he defines the core aim of the state as achieving peace and security of life, which makes sense.
It does, but his understanding of peace is more nuanced than just the absence of war, which is how Hobbes defined it.
Okay, so what does peace look like for Spinoza?
He defines it as a union or harmony of minds. It's not just about suppressing violence, it's about fostering a genuine sense of unity and shared understanding amongst citizens.
So internal cohesion is just as important as external security.
Absolutely. And he recognizes that achieving this kind of harmony is super challenging given the often irrational nature of human beings. But he believes that a well-structured state can minimize the influence of fear and ignorance, fostering psychological security and mutual trust, which in turn contribute to a more harmonious society.
It's about creating the conditions where people feel safe and secure enough to reason together and work towards common goals.
Exactly. And for Spinoza, well-designed institutions are key to achieving this. It's like he's suggesting that institutions can almost mechanize reason, channeling those potentially destructive passions towards the common good.
It's like he's trying to build a political system that can actually promote rational decision-making and minimize the impact of those irrational forces that can lead to conflict.
That's a great way to put it. And he dives into specific regime types, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, offering concrete recommendations for structuring each in a way that promotes stability and freedom.
So let's start with monarchy. Is Spinoza a fan of absolute rule by a king?
Not really. Even in a monarchy, he argues that unchecked power is a recipe for disaster. He points out that just because a regime endures, like those despotic Turks he mentions, doesn't mean there's genuine peace.
So just surviving isn't enough. There needs to be more to a good political order.
Exactly. And for Spinoza, that more includes those crucial checks and balances, what he calls the fundamenta of the state. He even compares them to the story of Ulysses tying himself to the mast to resist the siren's call.
It's like the sovereign needs to be bound by some higher principles or structures to prevent them from abusing their power.
Right. And Spinoza stresses the importance of a large council of citizens who can advise and influence the monarch. He's pushing even monarchies towards a more representative structure.
Yeah.
And he concludes that a truly well-functioning monarchy will actually resemble a democracy in many ways.
So what about aristocracy?
Well, Spinoza distinguishes between two main models: the centralized Venetian Republic style and the decentralized system of the United Provinces, which he seems to prefer.
Okay, so what makes a good aristocracy for Spinoza?
He points to a few key features. First, you need those large patrician councils to prevent factions from getting too much power. Second, you need mechanisms to balance private interests with the public good. And finally, he even suggests promoting a universal faith or civil religion to strengthen social cohesion.
So even in an aristocracy, some degree of shared belief or values is important for stability.
Exactly. And he makes this interesting argument that aristocracies are potentially more absolute, meaning more unified and capable of acting as a single entity than monarchies.
That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but he's suggesting that a well-structured aristocracy, with its system of checks and balances and its focus on the common good, can be a very effective form of government.
Now, unfortunately, Spinoza's discussion of democracy was cut short because of his untimely death.
Right, which is a shame because it would have been fascinating to see his full vision for a democratic state.
But from what he did write, It's clear that he saw democracy as a legitimate form of government, defined by popular rule based on civil status.
However, and this is important to note, his model of democracy excluded certain groups, like foreigners, those not considered fully independent, such as women, children, and servants, and those not leading what were considered respectable lives.
Those exclusions are definitely problematic from our modern perspective, especially his justification for excluding women based on supposed natural inequalities.
Absolutely. But it's also important to acknowledge his arguments for the epistemic advantages of democracy. He suggests that because the governing body in a democracy is larger and more diverse, it can potentially make more rational and informed decisions.
It's like he's saying that a wider range of perspectives and experiences can lead to better outcomes.
Precisely. And he even suggests that the perceived incompetence of the common people is often exaggerated and might be more a reflection of the secrecy and lack of transparency in other forms of government.
Okay, so now for a big question, one that's generated a lot of debate among Spinoza scholars. What is the state, really? Is it just a collection of individuals, or does it have its own independent existence?
Right. This is where we get into the debate between the realists and the anti-realists. The realists, drawing on Spinoza's account of individuation in the ethics, argue that the state can be seen as a kind of social individual.
Meaning it's more than just the sum of its parts. It has its own unique identity and even its own conatus that's striving to persist and maintain itself.
Exactly. Thinkers like Mathurin and Balabar are big proponents of this view. But the anti-realists push back, arguing that individuals always retain some portion of their natural power, that the state is ultimately dependent on its citizens in a way that individual physical objects aren't. They also suggest that talk of the mind of the state is just a metaphor.
And this debate gets to the heart of some big questions about the relationship between the individual and the state.
It does. The anti-realists worry that if you grant the state this kind of independent existence, its interests might end up overriding the interests of its citizens. This connects to critiques we see in thinkers like Isaiah Berlin.
Right, that whole worry about the state becoming this all-powerful entity that crushes individual freedom.
Exactly. But the realists offer their own counterarguments. Some point to Spinoza's discussion of suicide to show that even individual humans can act in ways that seem to go against their own self-preservation. They also argue that individuality itself is more of a spectrum than a binary.
So maybe the state could be more or less of an individual, depending on how it's structured and how much power it actually wields.
Right. And a realist like Leboeuf argues that precisely because the state's power can become detached from the will of its citizens, we need to be extra careful about limiting its power and ensuring that it remains accountable to the people.
Makes sense.
Huh.
So finally, let's talk about the reception and influence of Spinoza's political ideas. It seems like his legacy is a bit complicated.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride. While his metaphysics and ethics sparked a lot of discussion, his political thought was often overshadowed. Plus, there was that whole Spinoza and Spinozism becoming associated with radicalism and even atheism, which definitely didn't help.
So people were a bit hesitant to embrace his ideas openly.
Oh, for sure. The political treatise, maybe because it was published posthumously and incomplete, didn't make as big of a splash as the ethics. But the theological political treatise got a lot of attention, both positive and negative.
It was praised by some for its defense of freedom of thought, but condemned by others for its perceived attacks on religion.
Exactly. And the SEP entry mentions those critical responses from folks like Jacob Thomasius, Leibniz, Velthusen, and Pufendorf. They were really troubled by Spinoza's naturalistic account of right and obligation, arguing that morality needed a firmer foundation than just the laws of nature.
It's like they felt that without God as the ultimate source of moral authority, everything would fall apart.
Right. But even with those criticisms, Spinoza's ideas did have a significant impact. Early advocates for toleration, like Bayle, Locke, and Toland, were clearly influenced by his arguments, even if they weren't always explicit about it.
It's like they were picking up on those threads of Spinoza's thought and weaving them into their own arguments for religious freedom and freedom of expression.
Exactly. And later Enlightenment thinkers really ran with that distinction between thought and expression, which they argued should be protected, and actions which remain subject to state control. We see this in figures like Mendelssohn, and even in the policies of someone like Frederick the Great, as analyzed by Kant.
So that separation between the inner realm of thought and the outer realm of action, became really important for Enlightenment conceptions of liberty.
It did. And Spinoza's naturalistic framework also resonated with some French Enlightenment thinkers, even though his own political approach wasn't explicitly revolutionary. Some scholars even see connections between his ideas and Rousseau's notion of the general will and Diderot's materialist philosophy.
So even though he wasn't calling for a revolution, his ideas about human nature and the foundations of political order found fertile ground in Enlightenment thought.
They did. And it's interesting, there was also this brief period where Spinoza was embraced by some Russian Marxists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They saw his materialist metaphysics as aligning with their own worldview.
So his influence has popped up in some unexpected places.
It has. And the Seppi entry concludes by noting that there's been a real resurgence of interest in Spinoza's political philosophy in recent decades, especially among leftist thinkers in France.
Like they're rediscovering his relevance for thinking about contemporary issues.
Precisely. And there's growing recognition that his ideas can contribute to debates about democracy, toleration, the nature of authority, and the complex ways that institutions and emotions shape our political realities.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Spinoza's political philosophy, let's recap some key takeaways for you, our philosophically minded listener. We started with his foundational commitment to metaphysical naturalism, this idea that everything, including politics, operates according to the laws of nature. This led him to redefine core concepts like rights and obligations, grounding them in power rather than moral absolutes.
We explored his nuanced defense of freedom of thought, recognizing that it has limits but is ultimately essential for a healthy society. And we traced the complex and often winding path of his influence on later thinkers.
And while this deep dive was pretty thorough, it only scratched the surface of Spinoza's incredibly rich and challenging political philosophy. Hopefully has given you a solid foundation for your own continued exploration.
And speaking of further exploration, here's a final thought-provoking question to ponder. Given Spinoza's focus on power and his vision of a state aimed at achieving a harmony of minds, what does his philosophy tell us about the political conflicts we see today? What would Spinoza say about the role of ideology in shaping our political landscape?
And how would he navigate those tensions between individual freedom and collective security in our increasingly interconnected world? These are big questions, but ones that are worth wrestling with.
Absolutely.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. If there are other thinkers or topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, let us know. Until then, keep those philosophical wheels turning.
Keep thinking.